Dead America, The Soldier, The Day After, Part 9 by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. The reanimated woman crossed the distance between the mattress and Flint's chair in seconds, her bare feet slapping against the linoleum with a wet, uneven rhythm. Blood from the man's neck wound covered her chin and chest, soaking through the front of her shirt in a dark, spreading stain. Flint threw his weight sideways, toppling the chair onto its side just as the creature reached him. The zombie's hand swiped through the space where his head had been a half-second before, her fingers closing on empty air. The impact of the chair hitting the floor sent a jolt of pain through Flint's shoulder and hip, but it gave him the angle he needed. With the chair on its side, the arm he was cuffed to was now braced against the floor. Flint drove his boot into the seat of the chair and pulled with everything he had, using his leg as a lever against the weakened joint. The wood splintered with a sharp crack, and the arm separated from the frame, freeing his hand with the cuff still dangling from his wrist and a jagged length of wood attached to it. The zombie lunged again, dropping to its knees and crawling toward him with its mouth open wide. Flint scrambled backward on the floor, his free hand searching for anything within reach. His fingers closed around one of the lightweight student desks, and he swung it into the creature's path. The metal legs caught the zombie across the face, knocking it sideways and buying him another second. Flint got to his feet, snatching the broken chair arm from where it dangled against the handcuff. The piece of wood was about 18 inches long, thick and heavy at one end where it had connected to the seat. Not ideal, but it would have to do. The creature was already recovering, pulling itself upright with the single-minded focus that Flint had come to expect from the ghouls. It locked onto him and charged, arms outstretched and teeth bared. Flint sidestepped the lunge and brought the chair arm down on the back of the zombie's skull with every ounce of force he could generate. The heavy end of the wood connected with a dull crack, and the creature staggered forward, crashing into the teacher's desks and sending the pencil cup and textbooks scattering across the floor. The blow had dazed it, but hadn't finished the job. The zombie turned, a low moan building in its throat as it prepared to come at him again. Flint closed the distance before it could and swung a second time, this time catching the creature square on the temple. The wood shattered on impact, and the zombie collapsed to the floor, its body going limp as the brain gave out. Flint stood over the fallen creature, breathing hard, the splintered remains of the chair arm still gripped in his fist. He tossed the useless fragment aside and looked toward the second mattress. The man was already moving. His body had gone through the same transition that the woman's had, the stillness of death replaced by the twitching, jerking return to animation. Blood still poured from the ragged wound in his neck, but the creature showed no awareness of the injury. Its eyes snapped open, vacant and fixed on the ceiling for a brief moment before its head rolled toward Flint. The zombie sat up and let out a moan that was louder than the woman's had been, a deep, resonant sound that carried through the classroom walls and out into the hallway beyond. Flint could hear the reaction from outside, the sudden pause in conversation, the shuffling of feet as people stopped to listen. Flint grabbed the toppled chair from the floor and held it in front of him, the legs pointed outward like a crude barrier. The zombie rose to its feet, swaying for a moment, before locking onto the sergeant and launching itself forward. Flint jammed the chair legs into the creature's chest, stopping its momentum and holding it at arm's length. The zombie thrashed against the wooden frame, its arms reaching around the legs and its jaws snapping at the air between them. The force of its efforts pushed Flint backward, his boots sliding on the blood-slicked linoleum. He was still wrestling with the creature when the classroom door flew open and two of Christopher's men burst in, drawn by the commotion. Both of them had rifles in their hands, but neither was prepared for what they found on the other side of the door. The nearer man froze, his eyes going wide as he took in the scene. The dead woman on the floor, the blood covering every surface, and the soldier holding a snarling, blood-soaked creature at bay with a broken chair. "What the hell?" the man stammered. The second man was already raising his rifle when the zombie wrenched itself sideways, breaking free of the chair's hold. Instead of going for Flint, the creature turned toward the open door and the two fresh targets standing in it. It covered the distance in 2 strides, slamming into the nearer man and driving him backward into the hallway wall. The man's rifle clattered to the floor as the zombie pinned him against the cinder blocks, its teeth snapping inches from his face. The man screamed, pressing both hands against the creature's chest in a desperate attempt to push it away. But the zombie was relentless, its jaw working closer to his throat with every passing second. The second man stumbled backward, too shocked to raise his weapon. He bumped into the opposite wall and just stood there, rifle hanging at his side, watching his companion struggle with the creature. Flint was already moving. He crossed the classroom in 3 steps, passing through the doorway and closing on the zombie from behind. He grabbed the creature by the back of the neck and hauled it off the pinned man, spinning it around to face him. But he didn't kill it. Not yet. Flint locked his forearm across the zombie's throat, holding its head just inches from his own face as he turned the creature toward the 2 men. The zombie thrashed and clawed at his arm, its teeth gnashing wildly as it fought to break free. Blood and saliva flew from its mouth with each snap of its jaws, spattering against Flint's uniform. "Look at it!" Flint shouted, straining against the creature's strength. "Look at its eyes. This man was alive 10 minutes ago, lying on a mattress with the flu. Now look at him." The nearer man was still pressed against the wall, his chest heaving as he stared at the creature that had almost torn his throat out. His face was white, his hands shaking at his sides. The recognition was there in his eyes, the dawning understanding that the thing Flint was holding was not a sick person or a drugged-up lunatic. It was something else entirely. "This is what happens," Flint said, the muscles in his arms burning as the zombie continued to fight against his hold. "They get sick, they die, and they come back like this. And they don't stop until they've bitten everyone around them. This is what's inside your school right now." The second man had finally raised his rifle, though the barrel wavered between Flint and the zombie, as if he couldn't decide which one was the bigger threat. His mouth was open, but no words came out, his brain still trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had believed up to this point. Flint could feel the creature's strength threatening to overpower his grip. The zombie was freshly turned, fast and powerful, and his arms were tiring from the sustained effort of restraining it. He shifted his hold, locking both arms around the creature's neck in a rear chokehold that gave him better leverage, but brought the snapping jaws dangerously close to his shoulder. "I need something to put this thing down with," Flint said through gritted teeth. "Now!" The nearer man snapped out of his daze, reaching down to his belt and pulling a folding knife from a leather pouch. He flipped the blade open with shaking hands and held it out toward Flint, who couldn't take it without releasing the zombie. "You're going to have to do it," Flint said. "Through the temple or the eye, one hard push, straight into the brain." The man stared at the knife in his hand, then at the thrashing creature in Flint's arms. His mouth worked silently for a moment before he stepped forward, gripping the knife with both hands to steady it. "Do it now! I can't hold this much longer," Flint urged. The man took a shaky breath, positioned the blade against the zombie's temple, and drove it in with a forceful thrust. The creature's body seized for a brief second before going completely limp, its full weight sagging against Flint's arms. The sergeant lowered the body to the floor and stepped back, releasing the dead creature and flexing his aching hands. The hallway was silent. A small crowd had gathered at the far end of the corridor, drawn by the screams and the commotion. They stood in a tight cluster, craning their necks to see what had happened, but too afraid to come closer. A few of them had their hands over their mouths, and one woman pulled her child behind her and turned away. Flint looked at the man who had stabbed the zombie. He was staring down at the body on the floor, the bloody knife still clenched in his white-knuckled grip. His breathing was ragged, and his face was slick with sweat. "You all right?" Flint asked. The man didn't answer, but he gave a small, involuntary nod without taking his eyes off the corpse. The sound of boots pounding down the hallway preceded Christopher's arrival by several seconds. The older man rounded the corner with his revolver drawn, flanked by 2 more armed men. He took in the scene with a single sweep of his eyes, the blood on the floor, the dead zombie, the sergeant standing free of his restraints, and his expression hardened into something dangerous. Christopher raised the revolver and pointed it at Flint's chest. "Give me one reason I shouldn't pull this trigger right now," Christopher said. Before Flint could speak, the man who had killed the zombie stepped between them. He turned to face Christopher, still holding the bloody knife, and put himself directly in the line of fire. "He saved my life, Christopher," the man said, his voice unsteady but firm. "That thing on the floor was a dead man 5 minutes ago, and it tried to rip my throat out. The soldier held it back and told me how to kill it." Christopher stared at the man, then looked past him to the body on the hallway floor. His revolver stayed up, but the certainty behind it had cracked. He was telling the truth, the man continued. Everything he said about the sick people, about them dying and coming back. I just watched it happen. I just put the knife in myself. Step aside, Earl, Christopher said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. No, sir, I won't, Earl replied. Not until you hear him out. Because if what just happened in that room is happening anywhere else in this building, we've got a serious problem. Christopher's jaw tightened as he looked from Earl to Flint and back again. The revolver slowly lowered until it was pointed at the floor, though his finger remained on the trigger. He let out a hard breath through his nose and fixed Flint with a stare that still carried plenty of hostility, but now had something else mixed in, the first traces of fear. Talk, Christopher said. Every person in this building who has A-type blood is carrying the virus, Flint said. The ones who are showing flu symptoms are the furthest along, and they're going to turn first. You need to separate them from the healthy people right now. Not in an hour, not after you think about it. Right now. And put them where? Christopher demanded. Somewhere contained. A room with one way in and one way out, away from everyone else. And you need to get the healthy people ready to evacuate, because once the sick start turning, this building isn't going to be safe for anyone. Christopher looked down the hallway at the crowd of civilians watching from a distance. Flint could see the weight of it settling on the older man's shoulders, the realization that the threat wasn't outside the walls. It was already inside, scattered among the very people he had been trying to protect. How many sick people do you have in here? Flint asked. Christopher's expression shifted, the anger giving way to something that looked a lot like dread. At least a few dozen that I know of, he said. We set up a few of the classrooms as a sick bay. Flint felt the blood drain from his face. Dozens of people, all in various stages of the infection, all housed within the same building as hundreds of healthy civilians. We need to move, Christopher. We need to move right now. Get your men to every room with a sick person in it and seal those doors. Then start getting everyone else toward the exits. Christopher opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a shrill, piercing sound cut through the building. The fire alarm erupted from speakers mounted in every hallway, the rapid pulsing tone reverberating off the cinder block walls and drowning out every other sound. Flint and Christopher locked eyes, both of them understanding what the alarm meant. Somewhere else in the school, someone had already turned. A moment later, screams echoed against the walls from down the hall, somehow louder than the alarm. Chapter 2. The fire alarm drowned out everything, its shrill pulses hammering off the cinder block walls in a relentless rhythm that made it impossible to think. The screaming that followed was worse. It came from deeper inside the building, the kind of raw, primal sound that could only be produced by people witnessing something they couldn't comprehend. The crowd at the far end of the hallway erupted into panic. People who had been watching from a cautious distance moments ago were now shoving past each other, scrambling in every direction without any clear destination. A woman tripped over a pile of bedding and went down hard, and the man behind her nearly trampled her before someone yanked him sideways. Christopher turned away from Flint and grabbed the nearest one of his men by the collar. Get on the CB and call everyone back to the school, everyone. Tell them to drop whatever they're doing and get here now, Christopher ordered. The man nodded and took off down the hallway at a sprint, fighting against the current of panicked civilians flowing in the opposite direction. Christopher pulled the second man close and spoke directly into his ear to be heard over the alarm. Find Jackson and Webb and tell them to secure the side entrances, chain them, barricade them, whatever they have to do. Nothing gets in or out of those doors unless I say so. Go! The man bolted without a word, disappearing around the corner and into the flood of people. Christopher turned back to Flint, his expression stripped of any pretense. The hostility was gone, the suspicion was gone, and what remained was the face of a man who understood that the situation had just outpaced his ability to control it. I need my gear, Flint said. Christopher hesitated for only a second before nodding. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Flint's radio, tossing it to him. The sergeant caught it and clipped it to his belt in one motion. Your weapons are up front, in the office by the main entrance, Christopher said. Let's go, Flint replied. The two of them moved down the hallway together, pushing against the tide of civilians who were pouring out of the classrooms and common areas. Families clutched each other as they ran, children wailing as they were dragged along by parents who had no idea where they were going. The overhead lights flickered with each pulse of the fire alarm, casting the scene in a strobe effect that made the chaos feel even more disorienting. Flint kept his eyes forward, scanning for threats as they navigated the crowded corridor. Every doorway they passed was a potential danger, another classroom that could be harboring a freshly turned zombie. They passed the intersection where the side corridor met the main hallway, and Flint caught a glimpse of movement through one of the classroom windows. He grabbed Christopher's arm and pulled him to a stop, pressing a finger to his lips before pointing toward the door. Through the narrow window in the door, Flint could see a classroom that had been converted into another sick bay. 2 mattresses were on the floor, both empty. The blankets had been thrown aside, and the pillows were on the ground. A trail of blood led from one of the mattresses to the far side of the room, where a zombie was crouched over a figure on the floor, feeding. Christopher's face went gray as he stared through the window. His hand moved to the revolver on his hip, but Flint reached over and pressed the weapon back down into the holster. "Not now," Flint said. "That thing is secure in there. We have to get this place locked down, then we can deal with them." Christopher tore his gaze away from the window and gave a stiff nod. His hand was trembling as it came away from the revolver, but he swallowed hard and kept moving. They reached the main hallway that ran along the front of the building, where the situation was deteriorating by the second. Dozens of civilians were crowded around the main entrance, some of them trying to push through the front doors, while others were screaming at them to stay inside. The armed men who had been guarding the perimeter were being overwhelmed by the surge of panicked people trying to get out. Christopher waded into the crowd, his voice cutting through the noise with an authority that years of leadership had built. "Nobody goes through those doors," he bellowed. "Get back from the entrance now." A few of the nearest people stopped and turned, recognizing Christopher's voice even over the alarm. His presence created a small pocket of order in the middle of the storm, and the crowd began to settle, if only slightly. People pressed against the walls, making room as more civilians continued streaming in from the deeper parts of the building. Flint pushed past the crowd and ducked into the main office. The room was empty, the men who had been coordinating from the desk having been swept up in the evacuation. Papers and maps were scattered across the floor, and the CB radio had been knocked off the desk and was sitting on its side, the power light still glowing. His rifle and cleaver were propped in the corner behind the desk, right where they had been stashed after being confiscated at the barricade. Flint grabbed the rifle first, checking the chamber and magazine before slinging it over his shoulder. The cleaver went back to his belt, the familiar weight settling against his hip like a missing limb being reattached. He pulled his radio free and clicked the transmit button. "Captain Davis, do you copy?" Flint said. Static hissed for a few seconds before the captain's voice came through, partially obscured by the sound of an engine running in the background. "I'm here, Flint. We're mobile and heading your way. What's your situation?" "I'm inside the school. The sick people are turning and it's going bad fast. But I've got the civilians working with us now. Christopher's on board." "What changed his mind?" Davis asked. "He watched one of his own men put a knife through a zombie's skull. That'll do it." "Copy that. What do you need from us?" "The building needs to be locked down from the inside. Christopher's men are handling the side doors, but the front is still wide open and we've got a few hundred civilians trying to push through it. If those things get outside, we've got a whole different problem." "Agreed. Lock it down and keep the civilians contained. We'll set up a perimeter outside and start thinning anything that comes your way. ETA is about 5 minutes. Flint clipped the radio back to his belt and stepped out of the office. Christopher had managed to push the crowd back from the main entrance, though the effort was costing him. Several of the civilians were arguing with him, demanding to be let out, while others were simply frozen in place, too terrified to move in any direction. "What's the word?" Christopher asked when he spotted Flint. "My captain is 5 minutes out with the rest of my squad. They're going to hold the outside while we handle the inside, but we need those front doors secured right now." Christopher nodded and looked around the entrance area, his eyes settling on the heavy chain that was normally used to lock the building overnight. It was looped around a hook on the wall near the doors, thick galvanized links with a padlock hanging from one end. "Earl, get over here," Christopher called out. Earl pushed through the crowd, still looking shaken from his encounter in the hallway, but functional. He had wiped the blood from the folding knife and tucked it back into the pouch on his belt, though his hands still carried the stain. "Help me get these doors chained," Christopher said. The two of them grabbed the chain and began threading it through the push bars on the double doors. Christopher pulled the doors shut against the protests of several civilians who were still trying to get outside. A woman with a toddler on her hip grabbed Christopher's arm, her eyes wide with desperation. "You can't keep us in here," she cried. "Those things are in the building." "And there's more of them out there," Christopher replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "If we open these doors, they're coming in. The soldiers' people are on the way, and we're going to get everyone out. But right now, this door stays shut." The woman stared at him for a long moment, tears running down her face, before she pulled her child tighter against her chest and stepped back into the crowd. Christopher finished looping the chain and clicked the padlock shut, tugging it twice to make sure it held. Flint moved to the windows flanking the entrance and looked out at the parking lot. The vehicle barricade was still in place, and a handful of Christopher's men were still at their posts on the perimeter, though they were now looking back at the school with confusion and concern rather than watching the streets. The fire alarm was loud enough to be heard outside, and a few of the sentries were already starting to abandon their positions and move toward the building. "You need those men to stay where they are," Flint said, pointing toward the perimeter. "The alarm is going to pull those things towards the school. They need to hold out until my team gets here." Christopher leaned toward one of the windows and banged his fist against the glass to get the attention of the nearest sentry. When the man looked over, Christopher pointed firmly toward the perimeter and made a sweeping motion with his hand. The sentry hesitated before nodding and jogging back to his position, relaying the order to the others nearby. Another scream echoed down the hallway from the interior of the building, this one closer than the first had been. Several of the civilians near the entrance flinched and pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes darting toward the corridor. A few of the children started crying again, their small voices barely audible under the incessant pulsing of the fire alarm. Flint turned to Christopher, who was already scanning the hallway for threats. "How many armed men do you have inside the building?" Flint asked. "6, not counting me and Earl," Christopher replied. "The rest are outside on the perimeter. We need to set up a line halfway down the main hall. Anybody with a weapon holds that position, and nothing gets past them. The civilians need to be moved into the front half of the building, behind the line. Every room on this side of the building needs to be checked and cleared first." Christopher nodded, catching on to the logic. Contain the threat to the back half of the school and protect the civilians in the front. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it gave them a fighting chance. "Earl, round up whoever's armed and get them to the hallway intersection," Christopher ordered. "Nobody goes past that point without checking in with me or the sergeant." Earl took off at a jog, weaving through the crowd as he searched for the other armed men scattered throughout the entrance area. Flint pulled Christopher aside, dropping his voice so the nearby civilians couldn't hear. "I need you to be honest with me. How many sick people were in this building before this started?" Christopher rubbed his hand across his jaw, the lines in his face deepening as he thought. "I know of the few dozen I told you about, but people have been coming and going all day. Some of them might have been feeling sick and not said anything. There could be more." "That's what I was afraid of," Flint said. "What do we do about the ones who haven't turned yet?" "If they're too sick to move, we seal the rooms they're in and keep everyone away. If they can still walk, we get them isolated somewhere away from the main group, a room with a solid door and no windows at ground level." "The locker room's in the gym," Christopher said. "Concrete walls, steel doors, and the only windows are up near the ceiling." "That'll work. Can you get someone to move the sick who are still on their feet?" "I'll handle it myself," Christopher said. "Those people know me. They'll go where I tell them." "Be careful," Flint said. "If any of them are further along than they look, you could be in the same room when they turn." "I got it," Christopher replied. He paused, his hand on the revolver at his hip, and looked at Flint with an expression that carried something Flint hadn't expected. Regret. "I should have listened to you when you first walked up to that fence." "Yeah, you should have," Flint said. "But we can talk about that later. Right now, we've got a building to save." Christopher gave a single firm nod before turning and heading into the crowd, calling out names and issuing orders as he went. Within moments, he had gathered a handful of men and women who seemed to know the sick patients personally, and they began moving toward the interior of the building with purpose. Flint unslung his rifle and walked to the hallway intersection, where Earl was assembling the armed defenders. 5 men and 1 woman stood in a rough line across the corridor, their weapons ranging from hunting rifles to a baseball bat wrapped in duct tape. None of them looked like soldiers, but all of them looked like people who understood that what was behind them was worth protecting. Earl stepped aside to let Flint take the center position. "Anything comes down that hallway that doesn't respond to verbal commands, you aim for the head," Flint said, loud enough for the entire line to hear. "Body shots don't work. You have to destroy the brain or they keep coming. If you're not sure about a target, wait until you are. The last thing we need is to shoot a survivor by mistake." The defenders gripped their weapons tighter and stared down the dimly lit corridor ahead of them. The fire alarm continued its punishing rhythm overhead, and somewhere deep inside the building, more screams joined the first. Chapter 3. The first zombie appeared at the far end of the hallway less than a minute after the defensive line was set. It stumbled out of a classroom doorway about 40 yards down, its head swiveling toward the cluster of armed defenders. The creature had been a middle-aged man, still wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, both soaked through with blood. "Hold," Flint said. "Let it get closer. Don't waste a shot at this range if you're not confident in it." The creature broke into a run, covering the first 20 yards with alarming speed. Arms outstretched, a guttural moan rising from its broken jaw. "Now," Flint said. 3 shots cracked off at once. 2 of them went wide, punching holes in the cinderblock wall and sending chips of concrete flying. The third caught the zombie in the shoulder, spinning it sideways, but doing nothing to slow its advance. The creature regained its footing and kept coming. Flint squeezed his trigger and put a round through the bridge of its nose. The back of the creature's skull blew outward, and it dropped mid-stride, sliding face first across the polished floor before coming to rest 10 yards from the line. "Remember what I said," Flint called out to the defenders. "The head. Nowhere else matters." The woman on the end of the line, a tall redhead holding a lever-action rifle that looked like it had been passed down through 3 generations, let out a shaky breath and adjusted her grip. The man beside her with the duct-tape baseball bat was staring at the fallen zombie with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his weapon choice. "If you're close enough to swing that thing, you're too close," Flint said to him. "Stay behind the shooters and cover anyone who needs to reload." The man nodded, backing up a step and positioning himself between 2 of the riflemen. A commotion erupted from one of the classrooms on the left side of the hallway, closer to their position than the first zombie had been. The door burst open and a woman came running out, screaming and clutching a child against her chest. Behind her, 2 more civilians scrambled through the doorway, nearly tripping over each other in their desperation to get out. "Don't shoot!" Flint shouted, raising his fist to hold the line. The civilians sprinted toward the intersection, their faces twisted in terror. The woman with the child reached the line first, and Earl stepped aside to let her through. The other 2 followed close behind, a teenage boy and an older man who was limping badly, blood running from a wound on his calf. Flint grabbed the older man by the shoulder as he passed. "Were you bitten?" Flint demanded. "No, I fell on the glass," the man panted, pointing back toward the classroom. "The window broke when that thing came through it." Flint released him and turned his attention back to the doorway they had emerged from. A zombie appeared in the frame a second later, its head snapping toward the line of defenders. This one had been a woman, heavy-set and still wearing a hospital ID bracelet on her wrist. She let out a shriek that echoed down the corridor and launched herself forward. The redhead with the lever action didn't wait for Flint's order. She shouldered the rifle, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The round caught the zombie in the left eye socket and dropped it in the doorway, its body crumpling across the threshold. "Good shot," Flint said. "I've been hunting since I was 12, the woman replied, already working the lever to chamber another round. More sounds began filtering down the hallway from deeper inside the building. Screams, crashes, the unmistakable moaning of creatures that were multiplying faster than anyone had anticipated. The fire alarm continued its relentless pulse, adding another layer to the noise that made communication difficult at anything below a shout. Christopher appeared from behind the line, breathing hard and with fresh blood on the sleeve of his denim jacket. He had his revolver in one hand and was pulling a disoriented elderly woman along with the other, guiding her toward the group of civilians that had been pushed into the front rooms of the building. "The locker rooms are sealed," Christopher said, once he handed the woman off to one of the civilians near the entrance. "Got 4 sick people in there. 2 of them could barely walk." "How many have we lost?" Flint asked. 3 that I know of turned before we could get to them. One was in the cafeteria with a group of about 30 people. My guys are trying to contain it, but it's a mess in there. How many of your men are in the cafeteria? 2, and I don't think that's going to be enough. Flint looked at the defensive line, counting heads and calculating what he could afford to pull without leaving the intersection exposed. The answer was not much. Every person on the line was needed to hold the corridor. "I'll go," Flint said. "Keep the line here and don't let anything through." He turned to Earl, who had taken up a position at the near end of the line with a hunting rifle he had borrowed from one of the other men. "Earl, you're in charge of this line until I get back. Anything dead comes down that hallway, you put it down. Anything alive, you let it through and point them toward the front of the building." "You got it," Earl said, the steadiness returning to his voice now that he had a clear purpose. Flint moved past the line and into the rear section of the school, his rifle raised and his senses working overtime. He cleared each doorway as he passed, sweeping his rifle across the interior in quick arcs. Most of the rooms were empty, their occupants having fled toward the front of the building at the first sign of trouble. One room held a pair of bodies on the floor, neither moving. Flint checked them from the doorway and moved on. The cafeteria was at the end of the hallway, through a set of double doors propped open with rubber stoppers. He could hear the chaos before he reached it. Gunshots, screaming, the crash of tables and chairs being thrown around. He pressed himself against the wall beside the doors and took a quick look inside. The cafeteria was a large open space with long, folding tables arranged in rows. Most of them had been overturned, creating a maze of barriers that civilians were using for cover. 2 of Christopher's men were positioned near the kitchen entrance on the far side, firing their rifles at 3 zombies that were tearing through the room. A cluster of civilians were trapped behind a wall of overturned tables in the center, the creatures cutting off their only escape. Flint stepped through the doors and dropped the nearest zombie with a single shot to the forehead. The other 2 split, one continuing toward the trapped group, while the other charged at Flint. Christopher's men concentrated their fire on the creature heading for the civilians, dropping it after 4 shots. The remaining zombie closed on Flint fast. He squeezed the trigger, and the round caught it high on the cheek, tearing through flesh but missing the brain. The creature staggered, but kept coming, crashing into him before he could fire again. The impact drove him backward into the doorframe, his rifle pinned between their bodies. The zombie's teeth snapped inches from his face. Flint twisted the rifle sideways, jamming the barrel up under the creature's chin and pulling the trigger. The top of its head erupted outward, and the zombie collapsed against him before sliding to the floor. Christopher's men were already moving the trapped civilians toward the exit. One man on the floor wasn't moving, a cloth pressed against a bite wound on his neck. "Get them to the front of the building," Flint ordered. "And that man on the floor was bitten. Keep everyone away from him." One of the men understood without needing it spelled out. He pulled the injured civilians wide of the body as they filed past, and Flint helped the last few through the doors before following the group back toward the front of the building. When he reached the intersection, the defensive line was still holding. Earl had organized the defenders into pairs, each covering a section of the hallway. 2 more zombie bodies lay on the floor, taken out by well-placed shots from the civilians. Christopher was waiting for him, his revolver reloaded, and his expression carrying the harried look of a man trying to hold sand between his fingers. A young woman was beside him, a teacher based on the lanyard and ID badge around her neck. She was speaking rapidly, her hands gesturing toward the stairwell at the end of the main hall. "What's going on?" Flint asked as he approached. "We've got people trapped upstairs," Christopher said. "Mrs. Garza here says there's a group of about 20 in the science classrooms on the 2nd floor. They went up there when things started going bad down here, but now there are creatures on the stairs and they can't get down." "How many creatures?" Flint asked, turning to the teacher. "I don't know. I couldn't see past the first landing," Mrs. Garza said, her voice shaking. "There were at least 3 or 4 blocking the stairwell when I came down. I barely made it through." "Are there other stairs?" Flint asked. "There's a central staircase near the gym and an emergency exit stairwell on the east end," Christopher said. "But I don't know what the situation is at either one." "Then we take the closest one and deal with whatever's there," Flint said. He looked at Christopher, reading the question on the older man's face before he could ask it. "I could use the help." Christopher glanced back at the line of defenders, then at the crowd of civilians huddled in the front rooms of the building. Flint could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. the pull between protecting the people he had already gathered and going after the ones who were still in danger. "Earl can hold the line," Flint said. "He's solid." Christopher nodded, holstering his revolver and pulling a shotgun from one of the nearby men. "Earl, you've got command down here," Christopher called out. "Nothing gets past this line." "Understood," Earl replied without looking away from the hallway. Flint and Christopher moved together, past the defensive line and into the rear section of the building. The hallway was darker back here, several more of the overhead lights having failed since Flint's last trip through. They passed the cafeteria doors without stopping, moving toward the central staircase that Christopher said was near the gymnasium. They found it at the end of a short connecting hallway, a wide staircase with metal railings that led up to a second-floor landing. The door at the bottom was open, and they could hear commotion from above, voices calling out, feet pounding on the floor, and underneath it all, the low moaning that neither of them could mistake for anything else. Flint raised his rifle and started up the stairs, Christopher close behind with the shotgun. They climbed the first flight and turned at the landing, getting a clear view of the second-floor hallway through the fire door at the top. The door burst open and people came flooding through, a mass of panicked civilians shoving and stumbling over each other as they fought to reach the stairs. Behind them, pouring out of classrooms and converging from both ends of the hallway, a swarm of zombies was giving chase. The first wave of civilians crashed into Flint and Christopher on the landing, the sheer force of their momentum nearly driving both men off their feet. Flint braced himself against the railing with one hand, grabbing a stumbling teenager with the other to keep the kid from falling headfirst down the lower flight. Christopher was shoved against the wall, the shotgun pressed flat against his chest as bodies surged past him. Flint looked up through the crush of fleeing civilians and locked eyes with the lead zombie at the top of the stairs. The creature was tangled with a man it had grabbed by the shirt, the two of them struggling in the doorway as more ghouls pressed in from behind. The man broke free and tumbled down the first few steps, rolling past Flint's feet and continuing down the lower flight in a heap of flailing limbs. The zombies poured through the doorway after the civilians, a tide of blood-soaked bodies and snapping teeth that filled the width of the staircase. Flint raised his rifle, but there were still people between him and the creatures, making a clean shot impossible without risking a civilian. "Get below us!" Flint roared at the remaining people on the stairs. "Get down! Get down!" The last few civilians threw themselves over the railing or pressed flat against the wall, clearing just enough of a sightline for Flint to fire. He squeezed off 2 rounds in quick succession, dropping the lead zombie on the top step and clipping another in the jaw. Christopher opened up with the shotgun from beside him, the blast catching a creature full in the face and sending it tumbling backward into the ghouls behind it. The stairwell had become a kill box, the narrow confines funneling the creatures into a corridor of fire that neither man could miss. But there were too many of them, and for every one that fell, another clambered over the body and kept coming. "We can't hold this!" Christopher shouted over the roar of the shotgun. Flint looked down the stairs at the civilians who had made it to the bottom. Most of them were already running toward the front of the building, guided by the distant shouts of Earl and the other defenders. But a few had fallen, and others were too dazed to move on their own. He grabbed Christopher by the shoulder and pulled him back. "Fall back to the line," Flint ordered. "Get those people moving." They retreated down the stairs, firing as they went, the zombies tumbling over each other in their frenzy to follow. Flint and Christopher hit the bottom landing and turned toward the main hallway, sprinting for the intersection, where Earl and the defenders were already repositioning to receive them. Behind them, the stairwell vomited a stream of ghouls onto the first floor, their moans filling the air as they rushed down the hall.